Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I rise to speak for the Labor opposition on the bill, the Mining Amendment, Climate Protection, No New Coal Mines Bill 2016. I do so both as the leader of my party in this place and as the Shadow Minister for Industry, Resources and Energy. Let me make Labor's position on this bill very clear. We do not support the legislation before this House. We do not support the legislation before the House. We do not support the legislation before this House because we think that this is too blunt an instrument and will be highly destructive of the industry and of the economy of New South Wales and of all of those who depend upon the industry for economic support. But that should not be confused with being an uncritical urger or booster of mining or coal mining generally. The Labor Party, given its history, rooted in coal mining communities and other working communities over more than a century, has historically been very supportive of the development of the resources industry, including coal mining, and we remain supportive of coal miners and their communities. And we are very conscious of the profound economic activity that comes from coal mining in this state. We know, for example, that New South Wales mines produced 260 million tonnes of raw coal and 196 million tonnes of saleable coal in 2013. We know that the mining industry was worth over $21 billion, nearly $18 billion worth of coal. We know that around 85% of the coal dug out of the ground in New South Wales is exported and the rest used to generate electricity. Even in the government's most recent Clean Energy Action Plan, which, by the way, was 18 months late, but I'll come back to that, says that about 79% of the electricity upon which we depend daily still comes from coal-fired power. And of course, the 136 million tonnes of coal exported was worth about $15.2 billion. And coal accounted for something like 31% of all merchandise leaving New South Wales, making it the state's single most valuable commodity export. We know that the minerals industry pays about $1.6 billion to the New South Wales government, about $1.3 billion in royalties, the overwhelming majority of which comes from coal. We know that nearly $135 million has been paid in payroll taxes and nearly $146 million in land taxes. There's nearly $1.5 billion paid by the mining industry to the Commonwealth, overwhelmingly from coal. If you look at the value of employment and other value-added aspects of investment from the coal industry, we can see that in New South Wales in 2013, that's worth nearly $10 billion. That's $1.4 billion to the economy of the Central West, nearly $1 billion to the Illawarra community, $6.3 billion for the Hunter region, and over $300 million for New England and North West. We know that mining, most of which is coal mining, produces something like 20% of the economy and 10% of the jobs in the Central West and 7% of employment in the Hunter region. So it's historically been and today remains a very significant industry. The $1.3 billion paid in royalties, although of course it's interesting to note that the New South Wales Treasury can never get the royalty figure right. They always overestimate the royalties to be paid. Comprises more than 11,000 teachers that would teach in our schools. More than 40,000 people work in the New South Wales mining industry. The figures fluctuate between about 44,000 and 40,000, and of course there are other impacts across supply chains. It's not just direct mining.
Across whole industries.
I acknowledge that interjection. So we are very conscious of the importance, the economic importance of the industry. We are also very conscious of the importance of employment to people It gives them a sense of purpose. It gives them economic security. It enables them to raise their families and go about their lives. But we are also aware of the reality of climate change. I disagree with the previous speaker. In my side of politics, we understand that climate change is real and is being accelerated by human activity, and we don't shy away from that. We also acknowledge that Australia's carbon emissions are led by coal-fired electricity power. We know the contribution to emissions caused by fossil fuels, mostly coal. We know that it comprises up to 80% of those emissions. And we know that more needs to be done about those things, because we only have one planet on which to live, and it sustains all of us, and it has to. Otherwise, we just have nowhere else to be. So we understand the scale of the challenge that New South Wales, the nation, indeed the world finds itself in grappling with these issues. The need to transition to a low-emission future, to transition away from dependence on coal-fired power to cleaner, renewable, cheaper sources of energy. But we're also aware that there are consequences of that transition. There are consequences for those communities employed in coal mines and the industries that supply that industry. So we understand that what we are facing is a very complex set of issues for which there is no immediate or straightforward answer. And we do not think that this bill is the appropriate vehicle to engage in the transition. But make no mistake, there is a transition happening, whether we want it to or not. And I think, and I do take issue with the contributions of speakers from the government, because the problem with this space is it's becoming increasingly polarised. You have a situation where you have the historical uncritical urges and boosters who say the industry can do no wrong, yes, it can be a little bit more efficient, it can be a little bit more cleaner, but essentially there's no problem. And on the other hand, there are people, not necessarily in this chamber, who think the industry can do no right and must be ended forthwith. Life is complicated, and the truth is neither of these extremes. The reality about the coal industry in New South Wales, though, is I think about 83% of it is thermal coal, and that is the coal used to produce power. But some of it is coking coal, and of course the issue is you cannot make products like steel without coking coal. They haven't yet found a way to do that. But we are dealing mostly in New South Wales with thermal coal, and of course, as I indicated, coal generates up to 80% of our electricity. But people should also be aware that the coal-fired power stations all have a limited lifespan. Munmora, 1,400 megawatts of electricity, closed in 2012. Wallerawang, bought by Energy Australia, formerly Macquarie Generation, sold by Mike Baird, closed immediately upon sale, taking 1,000 megawatts out of the New South Wales economy, jeopardising our economic and energy security, all because of the negligence of those opposite and their previous Premier and Treasurer, because there was no guarantee sought or obtained that when Energy Australia bought Wallerawang, the 1,000 megawatts of energy would stay in New South Wales. The ink was barely dry on the contract before Energy Australia shut it down, presumably to increase the value of their other generation assets elsewhere. And of course, that extra 1,000 megawatts would have been really handy on the 10th of February this year. Liddell has 4 turbines. I was a bit distressed to learn that many of them are offline at any given moment. But when you delve into the history of Liddell, it's no surprise. Liddell was built to last 30 years. It's 46 years old and will not last forever. Over the next 2 decades, almost all of the coal-fired power stations in New South Wales, almost, because some will go 25 years, I think there's one that'll go for 30 years, but the overwhelming majority of the generators providing 80% of our electricity today will close over the next 10 and 20 years. Not because of the renewable energy target, Not because of any green schemes or government policy, but simply because of old age. It will catch up with us all. And of course the issue then is, well, you know, what replaces that power, that capacity that we lose? And of course in the olden days, it was governments that built power stations and provided power directly. But we live in a privatised national electricity market where we are all dependent on private economic actors to invest in new energy supplies. But the Abbott government did its best to destroy the renewables industry. There was a huge pipeline of investment that would generate thousands of megawatts of new capacity across Australia and for New South Wales, but because those opposite went to war on an ideological basis against renewable energy, a lot of the investment has been scared off. And the second problem, is, of course, the renewable energy target that did survive, tattered, bruised, battered, only has a 2020 frame of reference. And if you look at this government's target for renewable energy in the state, allegedly the same as the national target, about 23% or 23.5% by 2020, it's going to take this state 30 years to reach that target at current rates. And why? Because renewable energy in this state actually went significantly backwards before making a very modest recovery. So in the last 3 years, there's been a net increase of renewable energy in this state of only 1%. Because those opposite, you know, some of you can't decide whether you're for or against it. Others ideologically
I've got a very clear idea.
Yeah, I understand. I acknowledge that interjection.
So do I.
And the issue, though, is we cannot afford to take an ideological approach to this issue because it's all about security of power for all of us, for our economy, our economic activity, as well as our society, and for hospitals and schools and all of the other activities. We need to put our shoulders to the wheel to generate or to create new generation capacity. And let's just work backwards. The industry will tell you, and the financing industry will absolutely tell you, that new coal-fired power stations are not bankable and are not investable in this country.
Why?
It's not because of government interference. It's not because of any of those things. It's simply because the economics do not stack up. The economics do not stack up. For years.
Order. Take your seat, please. Order. The point of order. I don't think you need to do a point of order, but go on.
I'll be very quick, Mr. President. The government members are interjecting, and you're to ask me to...
Thank you for your point of order, and I uphold it, but I make the point that all sides were involved in that debate, brawl for a better term, and I ask the Speaker not to respond to interjections. That's disorderly, and ask members to observe the speech in silence.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. The issue here is that this ideological approach has undermined our capacity to invest in new power sources. If you look at the front page of the Australian today, we see very clearly the closure of Hazelwood. Not a decision of government, a decision made by a private company because the asset is at the end of its life. But the fallout from this is what we see when there is no planned transition. And I would like to pay indicate my respect for the Construction, Forestry, Mining and Energy Union, the Energy Division, and their identification of the need for a just transition. Not just any transition, but a just transition, because it is not fair that working people, their families and communities should bear the brunt of people's desire for a cleaner, low carbon future. But it is also the case that we have a choice before us of either having a planned transition or an unplanned transition. And in their submission to a recent Senate inquiry, a distinction is drawn between the unplanned transition and the closure and the consequences of closure of coal mines in the United States and the United Kingdom versus the much more beneficial social and economic outcomes of the more orderly planned transition in places like the Federal Republic of Germany. But it requires private companies to collaborate. It takes government to make long-term plans, and it requires the investment of significant amounts of money so that as coal-fired power stations, for example, close, and when that has an ongoing consequence for the mines that support them, workers can be relocated to other economic activities where mining is still ongoing, or transitioned to other parts of the economy. But platitudes and good sentiments alone will not deliver that outcome. It requires a significant financial commitment by governments, nationally and by jurisdiction. It also requires straight talking, because in the thermal coal industry, and the Adani mine in Queensland is a good example of this, there are people who continue to hope that the downturn that we've been experiencing in the thermal coal industry over the last few years is merely cyclical. Australian history is full of boom busts, particularly in the resources sector, and there are some people who hope and believe that the current downturn is cyclical and it will come good again. But there are other economic observers, such as Tim Buckley and others, who look at the hard data, who say, no, something more profound is at work here. There is a structural decline in the demand for thermal coal. If you look, for example, at China, China is reducing its imports of thermal coal by a magnitude each year greater than the whole of our mining industry. India, another objective of coal exports, is also reducing its foreign imports of thermal coal in a strive to become more self-sufficient domestically.
They're reducing domestic use.
And also, at the same time, both China and India are also reducing their reliance on domestic supplies of thermal coal as they seek to diversify the sources of energy they derive and where they derive their energy from. So what we have is a situation where, and this is not a matter of belief or government policy, it either is happening or it is not. But the reality is that we need to make plans for a lower carbon future. We do need to increase our generation of energies from other sources. So, because at the moment we are held hostage. Because at the moment we're held hostage to the decision of private investors as to whether they will invest in new power supplies and where. We are held hostage to the private operators who decide when and where they will close existing generation assets, leaving the states and people exposed to shortages and skyrocketing prices, which will negatively impact not just households but businesses and all forms of economic activity. So we need to create a situation where there is greater energy independence for us all, but we cannot be ignorant of the fact that it will not occur overnight. And crucial to this transition is storage technology, because you need to deal with the issue of intermittency. It is said as a truism that the sun doesn't shine at night and the wind doesn't always blow, and that's true. And there are storage technologies, and they are affordable to a certain degree, but they're not affordable at the level of household or individual businesses for most people. And the technology is still evolving. And talking to people in the industry, they expect the prices to decline by 40% over the next 2 years. But storage technology is the game changer, and there can be no transition without greater focus and investment on that. But all of that will take time, and this bill does not allow for a just transition or a sensible or balanced transition or a smooth transition, which is why we do not support it. We do not support this bill, but we are conscious of the need to address climate change. We are conscious of the need to address emissions from coal industry and more generally, and we are conscious of the need to wean ourselves off coal-fired power, because whether we like it or not, the sun will set on those power sources. And we need to have alternatives in place sooner rather than later. There is a lot more I could say, but make no mistake, we support coal miners and their communities. We will not give them false hope. We know that there needs to be a significant investment to enable those communities to thrive when the private operators of these mines make their decisions, because capital has no conscience. If they can no longer make a buck from it, they will up stumps and move somewhere else and leave the community stranded. And so we will not stand idly by and allow that to happen, just as we will not stand idly by and let the negligence of those opposite leave New South Wales exposed to power shortages and skyrocketing power simply because so many of them have an ideological belief against renewable energy, because that is not the future. That is being every bit as destructive of the common good and our shared economic and social futures as they accuse the authors of this bill as being, and we will have no part in it, Mr Deputy President. We will provide a sensible alternative as we head towards the next stage.
Order. For any